The other coaches around the league began to complain publicly that Dave Thomas and his boys were running up the score to humiliate their opponents. Well, that was the last thing Dave Thomas would ever do. And a Ravenna newspaper even wrote an editorial telling the whiners how wrong they were. Oliver Wolcott compared Dean Everwine to Dave Thomas with these words: "Everwine substitutes freely in his football games, but his boys are so good they can't help but score. Thomas has no good bench players, so he has to keep his starters in." Now, my father, Bob Goss, Art Joy, Frank Janicek, and Don Miller must have really cringed when they read the newspaper that day, because they were those bench players. The Bombers clinched an undefeated regular season championship with a 50-21 win over Garrettsville. Fred Stanley scored 31 points, but the box score reveals that Coach Thomas played his second string for most of the game, perhaps responding to the public outcry about running up the score, but at the same time showing that he did indeed have a depth to that team that nobody knew about when they needed it. The county tournament for the league trophy was next. Jim Purdy's Paris High School, still smarting from their earlier pasting, was the first opponent, and Fred Stanley had sprained his ankle. How good would the Bombers be without Superman? Once again, as he had in the season opener against Nelson, nearsighted Bob Fector picked up the slack. Raining impossible shots from all over the court, Fector equaled his season best with 16 points. Frank Janicek filled in for the hobbled Stanley, giving him one extra day rest. But it wasn't enough. The Bombers next had to face Palmyra, a team they hadn't played in several years. Now, the Redskins featured a guy named Bob Karras, who a few years later would sire Larry Karras, who is one of the greatest college coaches in American history at the University of Mount Union. With Stanley dragging around the court in his lowest gear, Karras put on a dazzling show of ball hawking and steals, and Palmyra pulled away after the first half to send the Bombers to their first defeat of the season, 24-18. So, they wouldn't defend their league championship this year. But the season wasn't over for Windham. They still had a chance to play into the sectionals, but they would have to win 2 consolation games on consecutive nights for that to happen. Fred Stanley wasn't going to allow a gimpy leg to end his career. Wincing every second of the game, Fred poured in 14 points to help beat Ravenna Township 28-10. In the consolation finals against the 14-1 Randolph Tigers, with Windham down 19-5 at the half, he scored 10 of his 15 points in the final quarter of a bitter contest to lead Windham to a 27-26 nail-biter. Oliver Wolcott was moved to call this one of the most courageous performances he had ever seen on a basketball court. I wish I could add a fairy tale ending to this wonderful season, but it wasn't to be. The Bombers drew a Copley Indian team which sported an 18-3 record, and with Stanley still not at full speed, the game wasn't even close. That 30-14 loss brought down the career on one of the greatest athletes that Windham High School will ever see. But Dave Thomas wasn't done coaching yet. He might lose Fred Stanley the next year, but he had Fred's brother Harold, 3-year starter Bob Turner, Con Thrasher, who was the kid brother of female legend Charlotte Thrasher, back as his starters. Art Joy and Bob Goss were now seasoned veterans, and Harold Belden and Frank Janicek were solid, not spectacular, but solid off the bench. They had to be. Thomas only carried 7 players on the varsity that year. And with such a small number of varsity players, and without the monstrous presence of Fred Stanley in the middle, Thomas decided that a pesky defense would be the Windham trademark this season. In the season opener against Nelson, his boys gave up only 3 field goals the entire game. The scoring was spread out among Stanley, Thrasher, and Joy in a 28-9 victory. The boys didn't have long to enjoy that win. The next day was December 7th, 1941, and that was the day that the world changed. The Record Courier suddenly became more interested in carrying lists of boys fighting for their lives than in complete stories about high school basketball games. Before the Bombers played another game, war would be declared on both Germany and Japan. Claude McManus became famous around Windham because he was the first person from Windham who got new tires from the ration board. He was the postman who needed them. As the Ravenna Arsenal began rolling off bombs 3 shifts a day, Windham began to click off wins as methodically as they had the year before. Freedom and Streetsboro managed to score only 23 points between them in their losses. Manaway, Shalersville, Braceville, they fell too, as Stanley, Joy, and Thrasher traded top-scoring honors nightly, and crowds began to fill the tiny Windham gym to overflowing as people sought some relief from the stream of bad news in the headlines every day. Eventually, their very popularity cost the Bombers an undefeated season. On January 21st, 1942, unbeaten Ravenna Township came in for a non-conference game. Windham jumped out to a 9-0 lead as fans continued to pour into the gym, filling the stands, the stage, and finally edging onto the court itself. The officials had to continually stop the action to clear the floor, trying to push the crowd back. In the game-long confusion, Windham's press was frustrated by having to dodge bystanders. Ravenna Township used spectators as moving pigs. And have you ever seen that touchdown through the band in California? That's what the game must have looked like. Ravenna Township used the spectators as moving pigs, and the Bulldogs' towering center, Bill Uttergeist, camped under the basket and pulled in long passes for layups. Slowly, Ravenna Township came back, took a 22-16 lead at the end of the third quarter, and withstood a furious Bomber charge at the end to win 26-25. Uttergeist had 16 of those points. It was the only regular season game that Windham would lose that season. 3 more wins over Garrettsville, Aurora, and Manaway Township wrapped up Wyndham's second consecutive undefeated league schedule. Again, the county tournament would be at Kent State University, and whoever won the conference trophy would have to win 4 games in 2 days to claim it. The Bombers opened with a rematch against Shalersville and came away with a 34-22 win. 3 nights later, it was Streetsboro who fell 48-19 as Con Thrasher scored a season-high 20 points. The semifinal against Randolph was a 34-16 laugher, in which the Tigers scored in only 2 of the 4 quarters. Windham was in the finals again, against Ravenna Township, the only team to beat them that season. And the Bulldogs were undefeated. In his preview for that contest, Oliver Wolcott took time to pay tribute to a Windham player. He called Harold Stanley the finest schoolboy sportsman he had ever seen in his long career as a sports writer. Wolcott explained that in the tournament game against Streetsboro, fouls had reduced the Rockets to only 4 remaining players. Stanley, the Bomber team captain, called timeout and sent Don Miller off the floor so that both teams would have an equal number of players with which to finish the game. That was the effect that a coach like Dave Thomas could have on a player. The actual game was everything that a championship game should be. Coach Thomas told his boys that the key to the game was shutting down Bill Uttergeist. They didn't. He still scored 14 points. But the tenacious defense of Bob Turner forced him out of the lane, and he had to rely on his outside shooting.